On March 10, 1945, Tokyo burned. By dawn, nearly 100,000 were gone. Most were women, children, and the elderly asleep when the fire came. This night, the deadliest air raid of World War II, has long been remembered for its sheer scale. But what history often forgets is what happened inside the homes, in the beds where mothers held their children, unable to escape the inferno that consumed them. This was Operation Meeting House, a bombing raid that left nothing behind but memories of the innocent lost. For one mother, it was the last time she would hold her baby. For the children, the last time they would wake up to a world of safety. What many don't realize is this: the raid didn't just destroy buildings, it destroyed families. It left behind nothing but fragments of lives, burned baby shoes, diaries, and memories that can never be fully recovered. Tonight, we will uncover the truth that has been forgotten, the story of the mothers who held their babies until the flames took them both. They didn't hear the bombs at first, they heard the sky scream. It was just after midnight on March 10, 1945, when the first B-29 bombers of Operation Meeting House began their deadly run over Tokyo. The air raid sirens had sounded earlier, but they were nothing new. Tokyo had been bombed before, and life had gone on. People still slept, not knowing that tonight would be different. The sky above them was clear, too clear. Then, suddenly, it wasn't. The roar of engines, the sound of bombs falling, the eerie silence that followed each explosion. For many, it was the first indication of what was coming, but by then, it was already too late. The bombs weren't just ordinary explosives. They were incendiaries, filled with napalm, designed to ignite upon impact. Tokyo, built primarily from wood and paper, was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And once the bombs began to fall, it didn't take long for the city to catch fire. One woman, now elderly and recalling the night decades later, remembered the flames creeping in through her window as she tried to shield her child. "I remember seeing the sky turn red," she said, her voice trembling. "It was like the whole city was burning, and we couldn't escape. At first, the fire seemed distant, far enough that they thought it was another part of the city. But as the minutes ticked by, the fire crept closer, and then, as though the sky itself had been set alight, the wind picked up, carrying the flames through the streets. It wasn't long before people realized that there would be no safe place. Inside their homes, mothers tried to shield their children, covering them with whatever they could find. Some grabbed their babies and rushed into the streets, desperate to escape. Others turned to the only option they believed: they had left the shelters. Dug into the earth, these shelters were supposed to protect them from the worst of the raid, but they had one fatal flaw. They were too small, and the air would soon become impossible to breathe. One survivor recalls rushing to the shelter with her 2 young children. "I held them close," she said. "We didn't know it then, but the fire had already caught us." The heat began to build. The smell of smoke filled the air. The sirens screamed again, but now it wasn't the bombs that people feared, it was the flames. A mother's first instinct was to protect her child. But when fire comes, there is no hiding. As the firestorm raged through Tokyo, families scrambled to find shelter from the flames. The streets were choked with smoke, the air thick with the stench of burning wood and fuel. Desperation set in. The only place many believed would be safe was underground. The shelters, dug into the earth, were tiny, cramped spaces meant to offer protection from bombings, but never designed to withstand the fury of fire. Mothers wrapped their children in blankets, pulling them into the cool, dark spaces beneath their homes, praying the walls would hold. One woman, now a grandmother, recalled taking her 2 daughters into the shelter, the thick smoke already seeping in. "I remember thinking we were safe," she said, "but the heat, it was unbearable. I thought we'd suffocate before the fire even reached us." In the tight quarters of the shelters, many parents tried to keep their children calm. They whispered comforting words, holding them close, trying to protect them from both the choking smoke and the unimaginable heat. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that the fire was not something that could be outrun or outlasted. One mother, clutching her infant, recalled trying to shield her child from the smoke, covering him with the only thing she had, her own body. But even that wasn't enough. The heat became too intense, and her baby started to struggle for breath. "I felt him slip away," she said, her voice breaking. "But I couldn't leave him. I couldn't let go." Outside, the fire had become a force of nature, its heat so fierce it began to tear apart the very streets themselves. The sky was now an endless wall of flames. The wind, whipped up by the intensity of the fire, carried embers that landed everywhere, sparking even more fires. What had begun as a single bomb now felt like a relentless wave that would not stop until it had consumed everything in its path. For those trapped in the shelters, there was no escape. Even if they had wanted to leave, they couldn't. The streets were impassable, blocked by debris and flames. And so they waited, huddled together in the dark, knowing that outside, death was closing in. One survivor, who managed to crawl out of the shelter days later, recalled the sight that greeted her. "The city was gone," she said. "There was nothing left but ruins and the smell of death. But the worst part wasn't the destruction, it was the silence. The fire had taken everything, the city, the homes, the lives of those who had lived there. But for some, it was the silence that would remain. For some, the flames were an end. For others, the choice was between life and the impossible. As the firestorm raged through Tokyo, the heat was unbearable. Streets became rivers of flame, and families who had rushed to safety found themselves trapped by the fire's insidious advance. For many, the escape route was gone, leaving them with nothing but the uncertainty of their survival. In these moments, parents made impossible choices, ones no human should ever have to make. Mothers who had tried to shield their children in the shelters found themselves unable to save them from the heat and smoke that threatened to consume them. Fathers, too, had to make desperate decisions, knowing that even if they tried to carry their children to safety, they might not survive the journey. One mother, now an older woman, recalled how she and her 2 young children had fled their burning house in the middle of the night. She carried one child, but the other, too young to walk, could not keep up. "I had to make a choice," she said, her voice trembling. "I couldn't carry them both, and I couldn't leave one behind, so I just ran, and I never saw him again." Another woman described clutching her infant to her chest as she ran through the streets. Her other child was in her arms, but she couldn't hold them both. The heat and smoke had already begun to overwhelm her. "I remember hearing them cry," she said, "but I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. It was like I was running away from the fire, but also running away from everything." In many cases, the children didn't understand what was happening. Their cries mixed with the wailing sirens and the roaring flames. Some tried to flee on their own, others clung to their mother's skirts, unsure of what to do. And yet, no matter how hard they tried, there was no escaping the fire. One survivor recalled the moment she had to leave her mother behind. She was running through the streets with her younger brother, and they couldn't keep up. Her mother urged them to go, to escape, while she stayed behind. But the child could only hear the desperation in her voice, the hopelessness. She never saw her mother again. "I could still hear her calling to me," she said softly. But the fire was too loud. For many, the final moments of their lives were spent in a last embrace, a final effort to shield their children from the inevitable. One man, now in his 80s, recalled how he and his mother held hands until the smoke overcame them. "We didn't let go. We just held on," he said, the memory still vivid. "I never saw her again after that night, but I will always remember her holding my hand." Dawn came, but there was no waking. Tokyo was gone, and with it, so many dreams. By the time the first rays of sunlight pierced the smoke-filled sky on March 10, 1945, the devastation was unimaginable. Entire neighborhoods, once bustling with life, were now reduced to rubble and ash. The streets were a wasteland of charred remnants, blackened debris, and the eerie quiet that follows a great tragedy. The city, one of the largest and most vibrant in the world, had been transformed overnight into a graveyard. Yet it was not just the physical destruction that was most haunting, it was the absence. The people were gone. A young survivor, now elderly, described waking up amidst the ruins, still covered in ash. "I remember the silence," she said. "There was no crying, no shouting, just the smell of smoke and the wind carrying ash through the streets." For those who survived, the morning after was more like a waking nightmare than the beginning of a new day. The world they had known was gone, replaced by a landscape of devastation. They could no longer recognize their homes, their neighborhoods, or the streets they had once walked. What remained were only the memories of the lives lost. One father, who had been out searching for his family, recounted finding his daughter's favorite toy among the ruins. It was a small doll, burned almost beyond recognition. "I didn't even know if it was hers," he said, tears welling up in his eyes. "But when I touched it, I knew. It was all I had left." Families who had tried to escape the fire the night before found themselves searching through the wreckage for loved ones. Some had made it to the rivers, but many had been caught in the chaos of the firestorm or suffocated in their shelters. Survivors described hearing the faint cries of children, those who had managed to escape the immediate flames but were too weak to survive the aftermath. For some, the search was futile. Mothers never found their children, fathers never found their wives. The air was thick with smoke, the ground hot beneath their feet. People stumbled through the wreckage, calling out for loved ones, but the silence that answered was deafening. One woman, who had survived with her husband and children, recalled how they tried to search for their neighbors. "We went through every alley, every block," she said, "but the streets were empty. No one was left." And then the realization came. Not just the buildings were gone, but the people. Tokyo, once a bustling metropolis, had been reduced to ashes. The loss was too great to grasp, too complete to measure. In the weeks that followed, the recovery process began. It was not just the city that needed rebuilding, but the hearts of the survivors. The task seemed impossible. But in the aftermath of such horror, one thing was clear: there would be no forgetting this night. Tokyo may have risen from the ashes, but some things could never be rebuilt. In the months following the raid, Japan's capital began to rebuild. The broken buildings were cleared, and new structures began to rise in their place. The physical scars of the firestorm would eventually fade, but the emotional wounds left by the raid were far deeper and harder to heal. For those who had lost everything, the process of rebuilding was more than just putting up walls or repairing roads. It was about reconciling with the lost, those whose faces would never again be seen, whose voices would never again be heard. One man, who had lost his wife and 2 children, recalled how he spent days wandering the ruins, searching for any sign of his family. "I walked through the streets, calling out their names, but the wind took them away," he said. "There was no sound, no response. I don't think I ever really believed they were gone, not until I saw the empty spaces where our house used to be." In the midst of this grief, some found small fragments of their former lives, a singed photograph, a burned trinket, a piece of clothing that somehow survived the fire. These remnants, though little more than ashes themselves, became symbols of what had been lost. To hold them was to hold onto a piece of a life that could never be returned. A woman who had lost her husband that night recalled the one object that kept her going, a small children's book her daughter had always read before bed. "It was burned, but I kept it," she said. "I couldn't let go. It was all I had left of her, of the life we had. While the physical city was being rebuilt, the memories of the raid were harder to repair. The emotional toll of the firestorm lingered long after the smoke had cleared. For many, the memories of their lost loved ones were the only things left. In the years that followed, Japan would face its own reckoning, not just with the war, but with the trauma of what had happened that night. Survivors were left with not only the loss of their homes, but the loss of their innocence. For many, the horror of the raid would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Even as they rebuilt, they carried the memories of those who never had a chance to. In the ashes, a vow was made, not just to rebuild, but to remember. As Tokyo began its long and difficult process of recovery, the scars left by the firebombing raid on March 10, 1945, were more than just physical. The emotional cost of that night was something Japan could not ignore. The families who survived, the communities that had been torn apart, would carry the weight of the raid for generations to come. But amidst the grief, something powerful emerged. A vow that Japan would never forget the innocence lost that night. In the months after the raid, memorials began to spring up, not only to honor the military dead, but also to remember the innocent civilians who perished in the flames. For the survivors, the fight wasn't just about rebuilding their homes, it was about preserving the memory of those who never had the chance to live in a rebuilt world. One elderly woman, who had lost her children in the raid, described how she helped establish a memorial in her neighborhood. "It wasn't just for my children," she said. "It was for all the children we lost. We couldn't bring them back, but we could make sure no one ever forgot them." In schools across Japan, the tragedy of March 10th became a topic of remembrance. Teachers spoke not only of the military victories and losses, but of the human cost of war, the innocent lives lost in bombings, the children who never grew up, the mothers who never had a chance to see their children's futures. One man, who had been a child during the raid, remembered how his teacher showed him a picture of a burned baby shoe. "The teacher told us that this shoe belonged to a child who never woke up," he recalled. "He said we must never forget the innocent lives lost in this war. He said that this was a lesson we needed to carry with us. The vow to remember didn't stop at the memorials or the classroom. It lived in the hearts of every survivor, in the stories they told their children, in the objects they kept, even in the quiet moments of reflection. For many, the raid was something they could never speak of fully, but it was something they carried with them, always. And the vow wasn't just for the survivors, it was for the future, for the children who grew up in the shadow of the raid. The memory of what happened that night was a part of their inheritance. It was a story they would pass down, one of loss and survival, but also of resilience and the importance of peace. One man, now in his 70s, reflected on the vow his parents made after the war. "They told us, over and over, that we must never forget what happened. They wanted us to understand the cost of war so we could ensure that it would never happen again. They didn't want us to live in anger. They wanted us to live in peace." The vow to remember, to never again allow such devastation to fall on innocent lives, became an integral part of Japan's post-war identity. It wasn't just about rebuilding a city or a country, it was about rebuilding a future that would honor the lives lost. The sky that night was filled with fire, but what burned the brightest was the innocence of those who never woke. In the years following the raid on Tokyo, the city rose again stronger, more modern, and more resilient. New buildings stood where old ones had burned. The streets once again teemed with life. Yet, for many who had lived through that night, something had changed forever. Tokyo had rebuilt, but some scars could never be erased. The survivors of the raid carried the memories of their lost loved ones with them, as though the city itself had somehow taken a part of them with it. Their memories, though fading with time, never completely disappeared. For those who had lost children, husbands, or parents, The fire of that night burned within them, even as they tried to move forward. In quiet moments, many still remembered the children who had never had the chance to grow up. The mothers who had never seen their children's faces again. The fathers who carried the unbearable weight of their choices, the impossibility of what they had to do. The lost voices of Tokyo, carried away by the flames, were never forgotten. A woman, now a grandmother, recalled a small detail from that night, a piece of cloth she found in the ruins, half-burned but still recognizable. "It was my daughter's dress," she said, softly. "I never found her, but I found this, and I kept it." In the decades that followed, Japan rebuilt its cities, but the emotional cost of that night never fully disappeared. The memories lived on in the hearts of the survivors, in the objects they kept, in the stories they told, and in the vow they made to remember. For many, it was the vow to never allow such a tragedy to happen again, not just to Japan, but to the world. The memory of that night of the innocent lives lost became a reminder of the cost of war. It became a lesson not only for those who lived through it, but for future generations who would never know the flames that took so many. And so, as Japan moved forward, it carried within it the memory of those who were lost. It carried the promise that their story would not be forgotten, that the innocence lost that night would not be in vain. The US called it strategy. But for Japan, it was a memory that would forever live in the hearts of those who survived, and the hearts of those who would never forget the innocent lost in the fire. The sky that night was filled with fire, but what burned the brightest was the innocence of those who never woke. Tokyo rose from the ashes, as cities do, but it was never quite the same. The physical scars may have healed with the passing years, but the emotional wounds from that night, the night of the deadliest air raid of World War II, would remain, passed down through generations like an unspoken vow. For those who survived, the memories of March 10th, 1945 could never be erased. The innocent faces of the children lost in the flames, the desperate cries of mothers holding their babies as they tried to flee. The small, cherished items left behind, these became more than just remnants of a destroyed city. They became symbols of a loss that was too great to ever truly measure. Yet amid the devastation, Japan did rebuild. It rose from the ruins of war, not only physically but also in the strength of its people. The nation carried the memory of the raid forward, woven into its identity, vowing never again to allow such horror to strike innocent lives. The loss of innocence that night became the foundation of a cultural resolve to never forget the cost of war, to never forget those who perished in the flames, and to ensure that future generations would live in a world where such a tragedy would not be repeated. The US called it a victory, a strategic move in the larger scope of the war. But for those who lost loved ones, who clutched memories and fragments of their past, it was something else. It was survival, yes, but survival at the cost of everything they had ever known. In the end, the real victory wasn't in the rubble of Tokyo, it was in the hearts of those who made the vow never again. For the lost children, the mothers who never saw their children's futures, the families torn apart, and the countless others who perished that night, their memory lives on. Their innocence, taken too soon by the fire, is carried by every survivor who remembers, and by every child who is taught that peace is worth more than any war. In Tokyo's ashes, the vow remains, never again.